My last video on history and politics was 2 years ago on a Russian language channel that had a few thousand subscribers. 3 years ago, I shut down an English language channel that covered the same kind of topics. I went all in on business and technology after that, and I stopped making this kind of content completely. But the pull towards digging in the hard and sometimes uncomfortable topics never actually went away. So I have decided to bring this back, and I'm starting with a subject that people either avoid completely or scream about it without ever looking at the actual data. In this video, we're going to break down how Europe, a continent that's been associated with Christianity for most of recorded history, actually looks far more complicated than any headline about it. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why two people can look at the same set of numbers and walk away with completely opposite conclusions, and which parts of this story are actually locked in, no matter what anyone decided to do next. Based on the most recent estimates from 2025, there are roughly 46 million Muslims living in Europe, which works out to about 6% of the continent's population. Back in 2016, that share was under 5%. So in less than a decade, the percentage climbed by a full point and the absolute number grew by around 20 million people. France has the largest Muslim population by far, somewhere between 6 and 7 million people, close to 10% of the country. Germany comes next, around 5 to 6 million people, roughly 7%. Then the UK, with 4 to 5 million between them. These three countries alone hold nearly half of Western Europe's entire Muslim population. Zoom into individual cities and the picture gets even sharper than the national average suggests. In cities like Marseille, Rotterdam, and parts of London, Muslim residents already make up a meaningfully larger share of the local population than the national number would ever hint at, simply because migration and settlement patterns cluster heavily around specific urban centers rather than spreading evenly across the country. That's part of why the lived experience of this shift can feel completely different depending on where in Europe someone actually lives, even within the exact same country. Here's where it gets interesting. Even if Europe closed every single border tomorrow completely and permanently with zero new arrivals from anywhere, the Muslim share of the population will still keep climbing from about 6% today to roughly 7.4% by 2050. That means the entire argument people have online about borders and migration policy only explains part of what's actually happening. Non-Muslim Europeans currently have a fertility rate of about 1.6 children per woman. The level needed just to keep a population stable without any migration at all is 2.1. So non-Muslim Europe is already shrinking on its own, purely from within, regardless of who crosses any border. Muslim Europeans, by comparison, average around 2.6 children per woman, and the Muslim population is also about 30 years younger on average. Muslims under the age of 15 make up 27% of the Muslim population in Europe, while for non-Muslims that figure is only 15%. That's nearly double. Take France as the clearest example. Even under a complete migration freeze, France's Muslim population is projected to rise from 8.8% to 12.7% by 2050, purely from children being born into families that are already living there right now. Not a single new person needs to cross the border for that shift to happen. That single country level example is really the whole argument in miniature because it shows exactly why the migration debate and the demographic debate, while related, are not actually the same conversation. The second force at play is real migration, and this is where things get sharper and more unpredictable than birth rates ever could be. If Europe keeps receiving migrants at the same pace it does today for work, education, and family reunification without counting new refugee waves, the Muslim share of the population climbs to about 11% by 2050. If a surge on the scale of 2015 happens again, driven by wars like the ones in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the number climbs to 14%. Behind those continent-wide averages are country-level numbers that are generally starting once you see them broken out. Under the high migration scenario, Sweden's Muslim population could reach 30.6%. Under a more moderate scenario, the UK rises from 6.3% to 16.7%. Finland, which currently has almost no Muslim population to speak of, could climb to 15%. Norway could reach 17% under the same conditions. It's worth remembering how sudden the 2015 surge actually was, because it's the entire basic for that high migration scenario. In a single year, roughly 500,000 Muslim migrants arrived in Europe, most of them fleeing active war zones rather than choosing to relocate under normal circumstances. That's not a steady trickle building up over decades, that's a peak triggered by a handful of specific wars, which is exactly why the range between the medium and high scenario is so wide. Nobody can predict whatever the next decade brings, another Syria, another Afghanistan, or relative calm, and that single unknown is doing most of the work in separating an 11% feature from a 14% one. At the exact same time, the same model shows Poland, even under the highest migration scenario used for every other country, rising from about 0.1% to just 0.2% by 2050. Hungary and most of the rest of Eastern Europe follow a nearly identical pattern, staying in low single-digit percentages at most, even under the most aggressive assumptions researchers tested. The gap between Sweden and Poland isn't random, and it isn't coincidence. It's the direct echo of decisions made decades ago. Back in 1960s, Germany actively recruited Turkish workers to fill labor shortages during a period of rapid industrial growth, expecting most of them to eventually return home. Almost nobody did. People settled, built families, and their grandchildren are German citizens with German passports today. That single policy decision from 60 years ago is still shaping Germany's demographic projections for 2050. France's story runs on a similar but separate track, built largely through colonial deals to North Africa that predate the guest worker era entirely, which is part of why France's Muslim population is both older and more deeply rooted than in almost any other Western European country. Poland never ran an equivalent program of either kind, so it never built the kind of family and community network that keeps pulling in new arrivals decade after decade on its own momentum. Every country's number today is really the result of a specific political decision made by a generation most of us never ever met. Now for the part that flips the whole story. Even in the single most extreme scenario Pube modeled, the one where Muslims reach 50% of Europe's population by 2050, they still remain a smaller group than Christians and a smaller group than people with no religious affiliation at all. There is a detail buried inside the data that almost never makes it into a headline. In France and Netherlands, the fastest growing group by 2050 isn't projected to be Muslims at all, it's people with no religion whatsoever. Religious identity across Europe as a whole has been declining for decades among people with a Christian background, particularly younger generations who were raised nominally Christian but never practiced and eventually stopped identifying with any religion at all. So the real shift happening in Europe isn't that the continent is becoming Muslim, it's that Europe's religious landscape is splitting into three directions at once, with a shrinking but still enormous Christian population, a rapidly growing secular population, and a smaller but faster growing Muslim population concentrated in a handful of specific Western countries. That's a genuinely disruptive change worth taking seriously. It's just a completely different one than the headline usually describes. This is where the real disagreement kicks in, and it stops being about the numbers at all because both sides are looking at the exact same data. The first position argues that fast demographic change without strong integration creates real friction, completing legal norms, disputes over free speech and religious expression, and neighborhoods that stay segregated instead of blending into the wider community. People make in this case point to France, where tension like this has been visible for roughly 2 decades now, and a push for tighter migration controls, mandatory language and employment requirements, and a single legal system that applies to everyone equally without carve outs for anyone. Some go further and argue that European governments have consistently underestimated how long real integration actually takes, pointing to unemployment and education gaps that persist into the second and third generation in several countries, rather than closing the way optimistic projections once assumed they would. The second position argues that this entire framing is closer to manufactured panic than an actual crisis. The overwhelming majority of Muslim Europeans are employed, low editing, and becoming more secular with each generation, closely mirroring what happening with Irish and Italian Catholic immigrants across Europe a century ago, who were accused of the exact same thing at the time. This side argues the real policy priority should be investing in integration through better job access and education rather than restricting immigration, because exclusion is what actually produces the isolated parallel communities the first argument is worried about. They also point out that framing religious minorities' growth as an inherent threat has a long and generally dark history in Europe, and that the loudest voices pushing the panic narrative today often have very little interest in the data itself. The disagreement between these two sides was never really about the math. It's a values question about what European identity should mean going forward and how much cultural change is acceptable within a single generation, and that kind of question simply doesn't have a purely data driven answer. So here's the summary. The demographic shift happening in Europe is real, but it's far more divided and complicated than any headline you have ever seen. A third of this shift would happen even if Europe had closed every border yesterday. The remaining two-thirds still depends on a decision no European government has fully committed to yet. And even under the most dramatic version of the future anyone has modeled, Muslims remain a smaller share of the population than either Christians or people with no religion at all. And neither the panic headline nor the dismissive one actually captures what's happening here, because both of them are trying to compress a generally regional, partly uneventable and partly still undecided story into a single number that fits on a Trump plane. The real story is more interesting one. It just takes 60 minutes instead of 6 words to explain properly. The real question facing Europe was never really about how many people of one religion will live there in 25 years. It's whatever a continent that spent centuries defining itself through one shared identity can find a way to stay unified once that identity stops being singular for God. If this format landed with you, subscribe, because this is exactly what I'm bringing back. And if you want to help me make more of this, the donation links is in the description below. Drop your ideas for the next deep dive in the comments. I actually read everyone and pull topics straight from there.